The first time Rosa Garrison saw the cowboy standing in the doorway of her schoolhouse, she thought he was there to pull one of her students out early for harvest work, and she nearly opened her mouth to tell him the children needed their full lessons before the afternoon chores began. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with a hat that had seen better years and dust on his boots that told a story of long miles traveled. He stood at the threshold the way men sometimes stood at the entrance to a church, like he was deciding whether he had the right to be there at all. His eyes moved across the room with a kind of hunger that confused her at first, and then she realized he wasn't looking at the children. He was looking at the words chalked across the board behind her. "Can I help you?" Rosa asked, setting down her chalk and folding her hands together the way her own teacher had done back in Ohio, a gesture that managed to be both welcoming and authoritative at the same time. "Yes, ma'am," the man said, and he took his hat off and pressed it to his chest. "My name is Cecil Prescott. I was told this is where a body comes to learn to read." Rosa blinked. She looked him over more carefully. He was not a boy. He was a grown man, somewhere in his late 20s by the look of him, with sun-weathered skin and hands that had clearly spent years working rope and leather and the hard handles of tools. He was looking back at her with an expression that was composed and determined and only very slightly embarrassed, which she respected immediately. "This is the Ridgecreek Schoolhouse," she said carefully. "My students are between the ages of 6 and 14. "Yes, ma'am," Cecil Prescott said again. "I understand that. I'm not asking for a schoolboy's place. I would sit in the back and I wouldn't disrupt anything. I'd come before school starts or after it ends, whichever suits you best. I just need somebody to teach me to read." Rosa Garrison was 24 years old. She had come to Ridgecreek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, riding the train as far as it went, and then a wagon the rest of the way across the flat, sun-beaten land that was so different from the green hills of Ohio that she had spent the first 2 weeks here feeling like she had traveled to a foreign country. She had been hired by the Ridgecreek School Board to teach the children of ranchers and farmers and the handful of families who had built something permanent along the creek. She had not been hired to teach cowboys, but she had become a teacher because she believed in the power of letters on a page. She believed it the way some people believed in scripture with her whole chest, because she had seen what knowing how to read had done for people and what not knowing had kept from them. She had seen her grandmother, who could not read, sign papers she didn't understand and lose things because of it. "Come in, Mr. Prescott," she said. "Close the door behind you." He did, moving quietly, fitting himself into the chair at the very back of the room that was technically large enough for a grown man, because it had been built for Hector Aldermain's boy, who was 14 and enormous for his age. Cecil Prescott still looked slightly ridiculous sitting in it, his long legs bent at an angle that couldn't have been comfortable, but he didn't complain and he didn't fidget. Rosa picked her chalk back up. The children were watching the stranger with wide, curious eyes. "Eyes front," she said simply, and they obeyed. She did not send Cecil Prescott away that afternoon. She told him to come back before school started the next morning, when she arrived at 7 o'clock, and she would give him 30 minutes before the children came. He thanked her with a gravity that felt genuine, set his hat back on his head, and walked out into the bright Texas afternoon as though he had just concluded an important business arrangement. Rosa stood at her window and watched him mount his horse, a roan mare with a patient disposition, and ride back toward the west, where the Prescott cattle range began. She told herself she was simply doing her job. She told herself that a man who wanted to learn was a man worth teaching, regardless of his age or his profession. She told herself, very firmly, that there was nothing remarkable about Cecil Prescott beyond the fact that he had shown up. She was somewhat wrong about all three of those things, though it would take her a while to understand exactly how wrong. Cecil Prescott arrived the next morning at 5 minutes before 7. Rosa had not entirely expected him to come back. Many things began with good intentions in Ridgecreek and fell apart by the second day, particularly when the thing in question required effort and offered no immediate material reward. But he was there when she unlocked the schoolhouse door, standing beside his horse in the pale morning light, holding a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "Brought some biscuits," he said, extending the bundle toward her. "My housekeeper makes them on Tuesdays. I thought maybe you'd had an early start." Rosa accepted the biscuits because it would have been ungracious not to, and because she had indeed eaten only a small portion of bread before leaving Mrs. Halloway's boarding house, where she rented a room. "Thank you," she said. "Come inside." She had prepared for this. She had gone to her small collection of primers, the one she used for her youngest students, and had selected the most straightforward one, without illustrations of barnyard animals or rhymes about little lambs, because she had a feeling that Cecil Prescott, for all his willingness to learn, would not want to begin with the same book as a 6-year-old. She put a sheet of paper on the desk in front of him and a pencil beside it. She stood across the desk from him, not behind it, because she had found that standing behind a desk put a kind of authority between teacher and student that sometimes worked well for children but often just made adults feel judged. "Do you know the alphabet?" she asked. "I know it by sound," he said. "I can say it. I just can't match the letters to what they look like on a page. Not reliably. Some of them I can get. The big ones. An O and X, but the rest of them start looking like the same handful of lines rearranged, and I lose track of which is which." This was useful information. It told her that his difficulty was visual recognition, not conceptual understanding. He understood that letters represented sounds. He was not starting from nothing. "Write the alphabet," she said, "just as you know it. Capital letters however you think they look. Don't worry about being correct. I want to see where you are." He picked up the pencil with a grip that was careful and unfamiliar, the grip of someone who had held a pencil very rarely in his life, and he began. He moved slowly. Several of the letters were reversed or oddly formed, but he completed the whole sequence, and when he finished he looked up at her with an expression that was completely neutral, waiting for her assessment without asking for it. Rosa looked at the paper. She noted which letters he had formed correctly and which he had confused with similar-looking ones. "You've done this before," she said. "Sometime, somewhere." "I spent 2 weeks at a school when I was about 9, he said. "Before my father moved us further west. It didn't take the way it should have." "It took more than you think," she said. "We're building on something, not starting from the ground. That's good." Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, some small relaxation around the jaw, and Rosa understood that he had been braced for a more discouraging assessment. "Now," she said, setting the paper down and picking up a slate, "let's start with the ones you're confusing." When the children began arriving at 7:30, Cecil Prescott stood, thanked her for her time, and left without being asked to, which she appreciated, because the last thing the school board needed to hear was that the schoolteacher was entertaining grown men before the children arrived. The gossip in a town the size of Ridgecreek moved faster than the wind off the plains. He came back the next day at 5 minutes before 7. He came back the day after that, too. By the end of the first week, Rosa understood that Cecil Prescott was not the kind of man who started things and abandoned them. He came every morning with the steadiness of the sunrise, sometimes with biscuits, once with a jar of preserves that his housekeeper had apparently sent, because she felt bad about the substandard biscuits of the previous day, and he sat across from Rosa and worked at the letters with the same kind of patient ferocity she had once seen a man apply to working a difficult piece of leather into a saddle. He made progress. Not explosive, dramatic progress, but the honest, steady kind that meant something was actually happening and not just being performed. By the end of the second week, he could reliably identify every letter of the alphabet in both capital and lowercase forms. By the end of the third week, he was sounding out simple 3-letter words with enough confidence that he only occasionally backtracked to second-guess himself. Rosa noticed other things about him during those morning sessions, and she tried very hard not to. She noticed that he listened with his whole body, not the way students listened when they were waiting for their turn to speak, but with a quality of attention that made her feel as though every word she said was being carefully considered. She noticed that he had a dry sense of humor that surfaced rarely but precisely, usually when she said something that was technically correct but slightly absurd. And when he found something genuinely funny, his whole face changed, the serious set of his jaw opening into something warm and unguarded that she found herself anticipating more than she should have. She noticed that his hands, which she had initially marked as simply working hands, were also surprisingly careful hands. When he wrote letters on the slate, he did it with a concentration that was almost tender, as though the letters were something fragile and worth taking care of. She did not tell herself she found him handsome, because she was a professional woman with a professional responsibility, and because it would have been improper to be forming opinions about the attractiveness of a student. She simply filed it away as an observation, the way she filed away many things, and tried not to take it out and look at it too often. The town, predictably, noticed that the Prescott Cowboy was going to the schoolhouse every morning. Ridgecreek was a town of about 300 people in 1878, which meant it was large enough to have a general store, a saloon, a church, a livery stable, a bank, and 3 streets of houses, but small enough that everyone knew what everyone else was doing and had opinions about it. The school was a source of civic pride. The school board, composed of 4 men including the mayor, who was also the owner of the general store, had been particular about hiring someone qualified from back east, which was part of why Rosa had gotten the position. The first person to say something to Rosa about Cecil Prescott's visits was Mrs. Halloway, her landlady, who mentioned it at breakfast one morning with the careful casualness of someone who had been waiting for the right moment. "I hear Cecil Prescott's been coming around the schoolhouse," she said, pouring Rosa's coffee. "He's learning to read," Rosa said, accepting the coffee. "I teach. It's a straightforward arrangement." "He's a grown man," Mrs. Halloway said, settling into the chair across from Rosa with her own cup. "He is," Rosa agreed, "and he is applying himself seriously to an important skill. I don't see any reason not to help him." Mrs. Halloway looked at her for a moment. "He's a good man from what I know. The Prescott family has been on that range 15 years. His father passed 2 years back and left him the whole operation. He runs it well. He's honest. He doesn't drink to excess." She paused. "He's also never shown the slightest interest in any woman in this town, which some of the mothers have found disappointing." "Mrs. Halloway," Rosa said pleasantly, "I am his teacher, nothing more." "Of course," Mrs. Halloway said, and sipped her coffee with an expression of complete unconvincingness. The second person to say something was Harlan Dewey, who was on the school board and who stopped Rosa outside the general store one afternoon in the 4th week of Cecil's visits. "Miss Garrison," he said, touching his hat, "I wonder if I might have a word." Rosa had been in Ridgecreek long enough to understand that this phrasing was a warning sign. "Of course, Mr. Dewey. There's been some talk about a man coming to the schoolhouse mornings before school," Harlan Dewey said. "Some of the parents have raised a concern about propriety, you understand, the appearance of things." Rosa looked at him steadily. "Mr. Dewey, the schoolhouse is a public building, and I am a teacher. Mr. Prescott is an adult who has asked me to help him learn to read, which I have agreed to do. Our sessions take place in the schoolhouse, which has large windows visible from the road, before school hours and consist entirely of literacy instruction. I am not aware of any rule, written or otherwise, that prohibits me from teaching an adult member of this community." Harlan Dewey blinked. He had not expected quite that level of directness. No, of course not. "I just wanted to make sure everything was above board." "It is entirely above board," Rosa said. "Thank you for your concern." She nodded politely and went into the general store, and she did not let herself feel annoyed until she was inside, where it showed less. When she told Cecil about the conversation the next morning, she wasn't sure why she told him. It simply came out while she was setting up the morning's lesson materials. He was quiet for a moment. I can come at a different time, he said. I don't want to cause trouble for you. You haven't caused trouble for me, Rosa said firmly. Mr. Dewey raised a concern and I addressed it. That's the end of it. Now, I want to work on your sight words this morning. You've been sounding out every word individually, which is good, but some common words you'll want to recognize without having to decode them every time. Cecil looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read, something warm and a little complicated. Then he picked up his pencil. All right, he said. Show me. The weeks turned into a month, and the month turned toward the warmer edge of spring. The prairie outside Ridgecreek was flowering in the way the Texas plains sometimes did when the rain had been generous, wide stretches of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush coloring the land in ways that almost made up for its flatness. Cecil's reading was advancing well. He had moved from three-letter words to short sentences, and Rosa had started bringing books, not primers, but actual simple books, a collection of short stories and a history of the American frontier that she thought might interest him more than fables about talking animals. She had been right. He was drawn most to things that felt real, to accounts of actual places and actual people doing actual things, and she found herself watching his face as he worked through a passage, the slight furrow of concentration between his brows smoothing when a sentence resolved itself into meaning. One morning, about 6 weeks into the lessons, he read a full paragraph aloud without stopping. It was from the Frontier History book, a description of the Chisholm Trail. He read it slowly and with some effort, but he read every word correctly, and when he reached the end of the paragraph, he put the book down on the desk and looked at it with an expression that Rosa could only describe as a man who had just discovered something he hadn't known was possible. "That's a complete paragraph," she said quietly. "You just read a complete paragraph." He looked up at her. His dark eyes were something she had been deliberately not examining too closely for weeks, but in this moment she couldn't help it. There was something in them that was open and undefended in a way she had not seen in him before. "My father could not read," he said. "He built everything on this land without being able to read a single deed or contract. He had to trust other men to tell him what documents said. There were times that trust was misplaced." Rosa was quiet, understanding now why this mattered in the specific way it mattered to him. "There was a water rights agreement," Cecil continued, his voice careful and even. "When I was about 17, a man came out to the ranch with papers and told my father it was a grazing agreement. My father signed it. It wasn't a grazing agreement." He paused. "Lost about 400 acres of pasture land. We got it back eventually through a lawyer, but it cost us 2 years of good profit to do it, and my father never got over the shame of having been deceived." "I'm sorry," Rosa said. "He made me promise," Cecil said before he passed. "Made me promise I'd learn. I kept putting it off. There was always too much to do, too many cattle to move, too many fences to mend. And also I was ashamed. Ashamed to go and sit in a schoolroom at my age." "There is nothing shameful about learning," Rosa said. She said it with more feeling than she had intended, and she could hear it in her own voice. "Nothing. Your father was deceived by a dishonest man, not by his own ignorance. The dishonest man was the only one with anything to be ashamed of." Cecil looked at her for a long moment. Outside, through the schoolhouse windows, the morning light was turning golden and the first birds were beginning their calls in the cottonwood trees along the creek. "You believe that?" he said, not as a question. "I do," she said. "Most people don't," he said. "Most people figure if you can't read, it says something about your intelligence or your character." "Most people," Rosa said, "have not given the matter adequate consideration." His expression did that thing again, that rare warming of the serious features into something close to a smile, and Rosa quickly looked down at the book on the desk and said they had better get on with the next paragraph before the children arrived. She was 24 and she was a professional woman, and she had a contract with the Ridgecreek School Board, and she told herself all of these things with great regularity over the next 2 weeks, while she also noticed that she was beginning to arrive at the schoolhouse at 6:30 instead of 7, ostensibly to prepare lessons, and that the extra half hour always seemed to run away from her somehow. It was at the beginning of the 7th week that something shifted. She had set him a passage to read independently while she organized the slates for the morning class. She was standing at the side table with her back partially turned toward him, sorting through papers when he spoke. "Rosa." She turned around. It was the first time he had used her given name. He had always said ma'am or Miss Garrison, with the careful formality of a man who understood that certain conventions existed for good reason. He seemed to realize it the moment he said it because a slight color appeared along his jaw, visible even through the tan. "Miss Garrison," he corrected immediately. "I apologize." "What is it?" she asked, and she was proud of how steady her voice was. He pointed to a word in the book. "I keep getting tripped up on this one. I know what it sounds like when somebody else says it, but I can't figure out the pieces." She came to stand beside him and looked at the word. Necessary. It was a genuinely tricky word with its double-letter arrangement, the kind that defeated people who ought to know better. She leaned over the desk to indicate the syllable breaks, and for a moment she was very close to him, close enough to be aware of the warmth of his presence, and she straightened up rather more quickly than the simple task required. "Necessary," she said. 3 syllables, necessary. The double S in the middle is the part that gets people. "Necessary," he repeated. He said it 4 more times, each time more naturally, and then he went back to the passage and read it through without stopping. "You said my name," she said before she had properly considered whether it was wise to revisit this. He looked up. The color came back along his jaw. "I did," he said. "I am sorry for that. It was presumptuous." "I didn't say it bothered me," she said. "I only noted that you said it." There was a silence. Somewhere outside, the creek was running high from the week's rains, and they could both hear it, a low, steady sound that was companionable in an odd sort of way. "You can call me Cecil," he said. "If you wanted to." "We should probably focus on the lesson," she said. "Yes, we should," he agreed and looked back at the book, and she could see the small, private pull at the corner of his mouth that was his version of a smile when he was trying not to show it. She thought about it for 3 days before she used his name. It felt like a threshold of some kind, and she was careful with thresholds. But on the Friday of the 7th week, when he read a full page aloud without a significant error, and looked up at her with that open expression of disbelief at himself, she said, "Cecil, that was excellent," before she had decided to, and the way his face changed when he heard it told her that she had perhaps been somewhat too careful with that particular threshold for somewhat too long. The trouble with Harlan Dewey resurfaced in the 2nd month, though it came from a different direction this time. A man named Gideon Marsh had arrived in Ridgecreek about 3 weeks prior, having taken over the failed hardware store and turned it into a land brokerage office. He was a sharp-faced man in his early 40s with an Eastern accent and a good suit, and the kind of smile that was wider than any emotion behind it. He had been making calls on various families in the area, presenting himself as an opportunity for settlers to consolidate their land holdings or liquidate property for ready cash, which was a service that sounded reasonable until you examined the terms closely. Cecil mentioned Gideon Marsh one morning without Rosa having brought the subject up. He said it flat and even, the way he said things when he was carefully controlling his reaction to them. "That man Marsh came to the ranch 2 days ago," he said, pulling out his chair. "I've seen him in town," Rosa said. "He brought papers," Cecil said. "Said they were a preliminary agreement for a water access arrangement. Said it was standard terms for the area." He paused. "I told him I'd read them myself before I put my name to anything." Rosa understood the weight of what he was saying. This was the point. This was the reason he had come to her schoolhouse at 7 in the morning for 8 weeks straight and sat in a chair that was too small for him and worked at letters with the concentration of a man dismantling a locked safe. "Did you read them?" she asked. "I read what I could," he said. "There were words I didn't know, legal words." but I could see the shape of it well enough to know it wasn't what he said it was. He looked at her directly. If I hadn't been able to read it all, I would have signed. He was very convincing. Good Lord, Rosa said quietly. I sent him away, Cecil said. Told him I'd need a lawyer to look them over. He didn't like that. He left, but I don't think he's finished. His jaw had the particular set it got when he was working through something serious. I wanted you to know that what you've done here mattered. What you're doing, it mattered in a way I can put a number to now. Rosa felt something press against the inside of her chest. It's your work, she said. You did this. You came back every morning. You opened the door, he said simply. There was a moment between them that was not quite like any of the previous moments, something that hung in the air of the small schoolhouse like the dust in a sunbeam, visible and quiet and significant. Then the first students began arriving, and Cecil stood and said good morning and headed for the door, and everything went back to its ordinary shape, except that it didn't quite. Something had been said, or almost said, or implied in the saying of other things, and Rosa sat through the morning's classes with a quality of inattention she was not accustomed to, and had to remind herself twice to address a student by name. That afternoon, after the children had left and she was erasing the board, she allowed herself to think about it directly, which she had been mostly avoiding. She was developing feelings for Cecil Prescott. She acknowledged this to herself the way she acknowledged other difficult facts, calmly and without drama, as a piece of information that needed to be dealt with. The question was how to deal with it. She had come to Ridgecreek on a one-year contract. She had no certainty of renewal, though her work with the children had been well received, and she had reason to be cautiously optimistic. She had no ties to this place except her work. She had come from Ohio, where she had a small number of friends and a mother who wrote her long letters every 2 weeks, and the life she had imagined for herself had always been somewhat vaguely professional and self-sufficient, because the men she had known in Ohio had not, with any consistency, made her feel that partnership with them was preferable to independence. She had not anticipated Cecil Prescott. She finished erasing the board and set the eraser down and looked at the empty schoolroom, the small desks in their rows, the afternoon light coming through the windows at a long angle, the framed portrait of President Hayes on the wall that had been there when she arrived, and that she had never felt strongly enough about to replace with anything else. She did not know what he felt, she told herself. A man could be courteous and respectful and call a woman by her given name, and none of that was the same as declaring a specific feeling. He was grateful to her, clearly. Gratitude sometimes looked like other things from certain angles. She went back to Mrs. Holloway's and ate dinner and wrote a letter to her mother, and went to sleep at a reasonable hour and told herself that in the morning she would teach Cecil to read, and that was the appropriate thing to do. 2 mornings later, she arrived at the schoolhouse to find him already there, which was usual, but also standing at the window with an expression on his face that was unusual, something troubled and tight around the eyes. "What's happened?" she asked immediately. He turned. "Marsh," he said. "He went to 2 other families last week, the Aldermans and the Holloways, your landlady's family. He got papers signed at both places." Rosa set down her things. "What kind of papers?" "That's the problem. I don't know the full legal language, but from what old Tom Holloway told me, it sounds like he may have signed over mineral rights to a section of his pasture land. Tom can't read, neither can his wife. They trusted Marsh's word." "That's terrible," Rosa said. "What can be done?" "I've already written to a lawyer in San Antonio," Cecil said. "I wrote the letter myself. It took me 2 hours and I had to look up half the words, but I wrote it." Something in his voice was complicated, proud and angry at the same time. "If Marsh is doing what I think he's doing, there are legal remedies, but those families need help quickly." Rosa thought for a moment. "Mrs. Holloway has been kind to me since I arrived. I would like to help if I can." "I thought you might say that," Cecil said, and for the first time that morning the troubled look eased a fraction. Over the next week, Cecil worked with the lawyer in San Antonio through a correspondence that Rosa helped him compose, because the legal language was complicated and his reading, while genuinely advancing, was not yet at the level of legal documents. She read the lawyer's responses aloud to him and translated the formal language into plain terms, and he made the decisions, because it was his judgment and his relationships at stake. She provided the tool, the literacy, the translation of symbols into meaning, and he used it. The Holloway situation proved to be exactly what Cecil had feared. Marsh had gotten a mineral rights agreement signed that gave his unnamed backers access to a portion of Tom Holloway's land for any resources found within it. The lawyer from San Antonio, whose name was David Ellsworth and who turned out to be a decent man, made the trip to Ridgecreek to examine the document in person. He found a procedural flaw in its execution that made it voidable, and with Cecil's support and Rosa's help preparing the necessary correspondence, the agreement was successfully challenged within 3 weeks. Gideon Marsh packed up his land brokerage office 2 days after Ellsworth served him notice of the challenge and left Ridgecreek on the morning stage, and there was a general sense in the town that this was an improvement. Tom Holloway came to the schoolhouse one afternoon, hat in hand, to thank Rosa personally. He was a red-faced man in his 60s with enormous hands and the look of a person who had worked the land all his life and intended to work it until it took him back. He stood in the doorway and said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, that he was grateful and that he was also sorry, because it was men like him who couldn't read that made schemes like Marsh's possible, and he was going to talk to his son about making sure the grandchildren got their schooling without missing a day. Rosa thanked him and told him the children's schooling was in good hands and that she was glad it had worked out. After he left, she stood at the window for a moment, watching him cross the road to the general store, and she felt, in a very complete and clear-cut way, why she had become a teacher and why this particular piece of the work mattered. Cecil was waiting at the end of the road when she locked up the schoolhouse. He was standing beside his horse, not in any pressing way, just standing, the way he sometimes did when he wanted to say something that wasn't quite a part of the morning lesson. "You didn't have to do all of that," he said. "The letters, the evenings going over the documents, that was above and beyond what I had any right to ask." "You didn't ask," she said. "I offered. You believed it was the right thing to do," he said. "I did," she said, "and it was." He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon was cooling, the way Texas afternoons sometimes did in the spring, a breeze coming from the south that carried the smell of the approaching evening. A mockingbird was doing its whole repertoire in the cottonwood across the road, cycling through its catalog of other birds' songs. "Miss Garrison," Cecil said, and then he stopped. "Rosa," she said before she could think better of it. He looked at her. The sun was behind him and she couldn't read his expression precisely, but something in his posture changed, a particular kind of stillness. "Rosa," he said, "I would like to take you to supper at the hotel if you're willing, not as a teacher and student. Just as two people who have been spending time together and who might like to continue doing so." The hotel in Ridgecreek had a dining room that served 3-course suppers on Friday evenings, and it was understood to be the appropriate venue for formal social occasions, including courtship, which was a word that Rosa turned over in her mind as she stood on the road in the late afternoon and listened to the mockingbird. "I'm willing," she said, and was pleased that she said it simply and without qualification, because she had been known to add qualifications to things that did not require them. The following Friday, Cecil Prescott arrived at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house at 7 in the evening in a clean white shirt and a coat that had seen careful pressing, with his hat in his hand, and Rosa came downstairs in the blue dress she had brought from Ohio that she had not yet had occasion to wear in Ridgecreek, and Mrs. Holloway watched them from the parlor doorway with an expression of such complete satisfaction that Rosa decided to forgive her for every meddlesome comment she had ever made. The dining room at the hotel was warm and lit by oil lamps, and the tablecloth was white, and the other diners were the kind of Ridgecreek residents who came to Friday supper at the hotel, meaning mostly older married couples and the occasional traveling businessman. Several people nodded to Cecil and looked at Rosa with varying degrees of open curiosity. They talked through the soup, which was a good beef broth with root vegetables, and through the main course, which was roasted chicken, and through the apple tart that was the only dessert being served that evening. They talked the way people talk when they have been having conversations for weeks and have discovered the shape of each other's minds and want to explore it further. Rosa talked about Ohio and her mother, and the teacher who had first shown her that books could be a world and not just a lesson. Cecil talked about the ranch and his father, and the particular quality of the Texas light at sunrise over flat land, which he clearly loved with a depth that surprised her. He talked about his younger brother, Emmett, who had gone to California 3 years ago and written occasionally, with news of various schemes that never quite came to fruition. He talked about the ranch hands he employed, 4 men who had been with the Prescott operation for years and who he regarded as something between employees and family. He talked about the cattle with a knowledge that was detailed and genuine, not the way a man talks about a commodity, but the way he talks about something he tends and is responsible for. Rosa found herself asking questions not because she felt she should, but because she genuinely wanted to know the answers, which was, she thought, a fairly reliable indication of something significant. "Why didn't you go to a town with more resources?" she asked at one point. "There are larger towns closer to San Antonio. There must be teachers there who could have helped you." "There are," he said. "I rode past 2 schoolhouses in the 3 years since my father passed without going in." "What was different about Ridgecreek?" she asked. He looked at her across the white tablecloth and the oil lamp between them. "I heard the school board had hired somebody from Ohio who believed everyone deserved an education regardless of their circumstances," he said. "Tom Halloway's wife mentioned it at the church social." Rosa blinked. "Patricia Holloway told you about me. She said the new teacher had a way of making things clear without making you feel small about not knowing them already," he said. Rosa was quiet for a moment, aware of a warmth spreading through her chest that was not attributable to the chicken or the apple tart. "That's the only way to teach," she said finally. "Not everyone agrees," he said. "Then not everyone should be a teacher," she said, and he smiled, fully and genuinely, and it was the most unguarded expression she had seen on his face, and the oil lamp between them made his eyes warm and dark, and Rosa put a very firm lid on the next thought she had and focused on her apple tart. He walked her back to Mrs. Halloway's at the end of the evening, and at the door he said good night and thanked her for her company, and said he hoped they could do this again, and Rosa said she hoped so too, and he put his hat on and walked back toward where he had left his horse at the livery, and Rosa went inside and up the stairs and sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall for approximately 10 minutes before she could be bothered to take her coat off. The lessons continued, though they changed in texture. The line between instruction and conversation had always been a permeable one, but now it became something they crossed deliberately, back and forth, sometimes talking through a passage he was reading, by discussing what it reminded him of from his own experience, sometimes talking about something entirely unrelated to reading before circling back to the lesson. Rosa had taught enough students to know that this was how learning happened for many people, not in a straight line but in a web of associations, and she let it happen. She also, privately, found that these mornings had become the part of her day she thought about most, a fact she noted with something between pleasure and alarm. He was coming along as a reader with a speed that she attributed partly to intelligence and partly to that quality of ferocious attention he brought to everything. By the end of the 3rd month, he was reading full newspaper articles, slowly but accurately, and he had been keeping a small notebook in which he wrote down words he didn't know along with their meanings, which he would look up from the dictionary she had given him access to. The notebook was getting full. She had given him a second one. He had also, without saying anything about it, started reading to his ranch hands. She found this out not from him but from one of the ranch hands themselves, a young man named Felix who came to pick up a supply order from the general store and recognized her as the schoolteacher and told her, with the straightforward pride of someone relaying a fact about a person they respected, that Cecil had been reading the cattle reports and the land surveys aloud in the evenings and explaining what they said. "He reads good," Felix said. "Better than most." Rosa thanked Felix for telling her and went back to the schoolhouse and told herself that a single piece of information did not constitute proof of anything at all about her general feelings. And then she sat down and had a conversation with herself about how long she intended to keep pretending that her general feelings were less significant than they clearly were. The answer, she concluded, was not much longer. In the 4th month, on a Wednesday morning in early June, when the heat was beginning its serious commitment to the landscape and the windows of the schoolhouse were propped open to catch whatever air was moving, Cecil arrived for his lesson and set a book on the desk beside him. "I read this last night," he said. "The whole thing." Rosa looked at the book. It was a slim volume she had lent him 2 weeks prior, a collection of frontier poetry by a writer she had liked as a student, not difficult reading but genuine literary content. She had given it to him half expecting he might not try it, because poetry was a different kind of reading from practical prose and many people found it initially baffling. "The whole thing," she repeated. "The whole thing," he confirmed. "It took me most of the evening. There were parts I had to read 3 times before they opened up." He paused. But when they did, he looked at the book for a moment with the expression of a man who had been handed something unexpectedly valuable. "I didn't know books could do that." "Do what?" she asked softly. "Say something so exactly right about a thing that you feel like somebody else has been living inside your experience with you," he said. "I've been in this landscape my whole life, and there was this poem, the one about the grass at evening, and it said what I've been seeing every day of my life and never had the words for." Rosa was quiet. She had felt this exact thing herself the first time she had read something that matched the interior of her experience, and she understood what he was describing from the inside out. "That's why I became a teacher," she said, "to give people access to that." He looked at her. The morning light was very clean and clear through the open windows, and the mockingbird that had apparently taken up permanent residence in the cottonwood was going through its repertoire again, and Rosa thought, with a clarity that was rather final, that she was in love with Cecil Prescott. She did not say it. She looked back at the book on the desk and said, "Tell me which poem. Tell me which one opened up." He found the page and read it aloud. His reading had acquired a quality of ease that had not been there in the beginning, a growing confidence in the sounds and their arrangement. He read the poem about the evening grass, which was not a long poem, 8 lines, but which was one of the truest things she had ever encountered about the particular light of the plains at sunset. When he finished reading, he looked at her, and she was aware that her expression had not been as controlled as she would have liked. "It's a good poem," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." There was a silence that was not awkward but was significant, and then the first child arrived banging through the schoolhouse door in the way that children who have been running arrive through doors, and Cecil stood and picked up his hat, and the moment was behind them. But not gone. Not gone at all. She had dinner with him again on Friday, and then the Friday after that became a standing arrangement without either of them having precisely announced it. They walked along the creek after dinner sometimes, when the evening was cool enough, and she would tell him about her week with the students, and he would tell her about the ranch and what was happening on the land. He had begun to read correspondence himself now, and had found, in a file of his father's papers that he had not been able to examine before, several contracts that were less advantageous than they should have been. He was working with David Ellsworth in San Antonio to renegotiate some of them, and there was a satisfaction in his voice when he talked about it that was something deeper than simple business success. One Friday evening in early July, They walked a little further along the creek than usual, past the willow grove and toward the bend where the water widened into a shallow pool. The sun was going down behind them, and the sky ahead was the specific orange and pink that the Texas plains produced in July, excessive and beautiful, and they were walking close enough that their arms sometimes brushed. "My contract with the school board is through the end of October," Rosa said, not planning to say it but finding it coming out in the way things did when you had been thinking about them for a while. Cecil was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "There's a chance of renewal," she said. "Mr. Dewey has not been unfriendly recently. I think the business with Marsh improved his opinion of me somewhat." "You deserve renewal," Cecil said. "The parents speak well of you. The children are learning." "But I don't know," she said. "I wanted to say it out loud because I think you should know that I am not, that my situation here is not entirely settled." He stopped walking. She stopped too because he had, and turned to look at him. The light was behind him again, that golden evening light, and she could see his face clearly this time, none of the backlit ambiguity of the hotel supper. "Rosa," he said, and the way he said her name was different now from the first accidental time. It was deliberate and careful and weighted with something she recognized because she felt the same weight on her side. "Cecil," she said. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because of the school, though the school matters. Because of this, what this is between us." She looked at him. "What is this between us?" she asked, because she wanted to hear him say it, not from coyness but because she thought it mattered to say things aloud directly rather than leaving them implied. "I think you know," he said, "but I'll say it if you want me to say it." "I want you to say it," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to be appropriate about it for about 2 months, and I have not always succeeded, and I am tired of pretending I don't know what it is." He paused. "You came here and you opened a door for me that I had been standing outside of my whole adult life. Not just reading, although reading." He exhaled a small, wry breath. "You looked at me sitting in a chair that was too small for me on the first morning, and you didn't make me feel small. You just taught me, and everything after that has been you." Rosa stood in the long evening light beside the creek and listened to the water and looked at Cecil Prescott and felt the particular warmth of something settling into place. "I love you too," she said. "I have been very professionally managing this fact for several weeks, and I'm also tired of it." Something happened to his whole face. It was not a dramatic thing. It was a quiet opening, like a window being raised. He reached out and took her hand, which was a small and simple gesture, and they stood there beside the creek with the sky going brilliant overhead, and Rosa thought that this was the kind of moment that poems were written about, and now she understood exactly why. He walked her back to Mrs. Halloway's with her hand in his, and they stood at the door, the way they had stood at the door the first Friday evening, except that this time he said good night with rather more weight to it, and took her hand and held it for a moment before he let it go. And Rosa went upstairs and did not need 10 minutes of staring at the wall this time, because she already knew exactly what she felt and found she was entirely at peace with it. Mrs. Halloway, who had apparently been watching from the parlor, said absolutely nothing, which in its own way communicated a great deal. The summer in Ridgecreek was serious business, the kind of heat that settled onto the land like a decision and didn't leave. Rosa taught through July and August with the schoolhouse windows thrown open and a bucket of water by the door for the children who arrived thirsty from the walk across the fields. The attendance thinned in the middle of summer as families needed children for the harvest, which was a reality of rural teaching she had been told about and had accepted as part of the work. Cecil's morning lessons had shifted somewhat. He was reading well enough now that the sessions were less formal instruction and more shared exploration, the two of them reading the same passage and discussing it, or working through a difficult newspaper article together, or him bringing something he had found difficult from a contract or business letter and asking her to help him parse the language. It was still teaching, but it had become something more collaborative, and the boundary between student and teacher had become honestly more porous than it probably should have been, but Rosa found she couldn't bring herself to reimpose it. She renewed her contract with the school board in August. Harlan Dewey presented it to her in the general store with the air of a man who had convinced himself he was doing her a favor, and Rosa accepted it with the equanimity of a woman who knew her own value clearly and had simply been waiting for others to catch up. The contract was for another year, with a small improvement in salary that she had requested, and they had accepted after only a brief negotiation. She told Cecil at supper that Friday. He reached across the table and took her hand and said he was glad, in a voice that put considerable feeling into 2 words, and Rosa thought that brevity of expression was one of the things she had come to love about him, because it was always precise. In September, Cecil's brother Emmett arrived from California. Emmett Prescott was 25, a year younger than Cecil, with the same broad build and dark eyes but a livelier manner, a person who entered a room at a slightly higher energy level than most people maintained. He had come back from California because his most recent scheme, something to do with citrus farming that Rosa gathered had been somewhat more optimistic in conception than in execution, had not produced the return he had hoped for, and he wanted to come home for a while and reconsider. Cecil received him with warmth that was genuine, and with the specific kind of patience an older brother develops for a younger one who has a persistent habit of reaching for things that are slightly beyond his current grasp. Rosa met Emmett at a Sunday dinner that Cecil arranged at the ranch, the first time she had been to the Prescott property, and she liked the ranch immediately with the unreserved instinct that sometimes happens when a place feels honest. The house was a solid ranch house that had been built with care and added to over the years, with a long porch across the front and a kitchen that smelled of coffee and the dried herbs that the housekeeper, a sturdy woman named Margaret who ran the household with cheerful efficiency, had tied up near the window. The land around it was flat and wide, and the grass was the color of autumn gold, and the cattle visible on the far pasture looked well tended. Emmett looked at Rosa with undisguised curiosity and then at Cecil with an expression of pleased surprise that he made no particular effort to conceal. "Cecil wrote to me about you," he said to Rosa over dinner. "Did he?" she said, glancing at Cecil. "He said he was learning to read," Emmett said. "He didn't mention that his teacher was, well, himself." He grinned. "He's always been a man of strategic omissions." "I mentioned you were the teacher," Cecil said evenly. "You mentioned a teacher," Emmett agreed. "You did not specifically mention that the teacher in question was the most interesting person currently within 40 miles of this ranch." "Emmett," Cecil said. "That's the nicest thing anyone has said to me since I arrived in Ridgecreek," Rosa said honestly, and laughed, and Emmett looked delighted, and Cecil looked at her with an expression that was fond and slightly resigned, the expression of a man who has introduced 2 people and discovered they are going to get on alarmingly well. Emmett was good company, and he was good for Cecil in ways that were visible even to Rosa, who had only known Cecil during what turned out to have been one of his lonelier periods. The brothers had a comfortable way of existing in the same space, a shorthand of references and gestures that came from growing up side by side, and watching them together told her things about who Cecil had been before she met him that the mornings in the schoolhouse couldn't have. Emmett stayed. The California ambitions were quietly set aside, and he took on a working role at the ranch, managing the eastern pastures with an energy and competence that surprised people who had written him off as a dreamer. Cecil mentioned this to Rosa one morning with a quiet satisfaction, the satisfaction of someone who had never stopped believing in the possibility and is now watching it become actual. September became October, and the Texas landscape shifted into its version of autumn, which was not dramatic like Ohio's, but was its own thing, a golden-brown settling of the light and the grass, a coolness in the air after dark that was a relief after the summer. Rosa had been in Ridgecreek for 7 months. She had stopped thinking of it as a place she had come to temporarily and started thinking of it as a place she lived. One October afternoon, a Saturday when the school was not in session, Cecil drove her out to the eastern edge of the ranch in the wagon to see the water from the rechanneled creek, which was a project he had been working on for months to improve the pasture irrigation. It was genuinely impressive, a simple but effective engineering solution that one of the older ranch hands had suggested, and that Cecil had researched and organized and executed. And standing beside the quietly flowing new channel in the golden October light, Rosa felt a wave of admiration for him that was not complicated by any other feeling, just clean and direct. He was standing beside her looking at the water with the satisfied expression of a man regarding completed work. "My father couldn't have done this," he said, "not because he wasn't intelligent enough. He was more intelligent than me in most of the ways that matter, but he couldn't have read the survey documents. He couldn't have written to the county land office to clear the water rights before beginning the work. He would have started building and someone would have challenged him legally, and he would have been in the same position he was in with the pasture land." He paused. "I did it myself, every piece of the paperwork." "I know," Rosa said. She had seen some of it, had helped him with the more difficult legal language early on, but by the later stages he had been doing it entirely without her. He turned and looked at her, and the afternoon was very quiet, just the sound of the water and the wind in the grass. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever your answer is, it won't change what I feel. I'm not asking from need. I'm asking because I want to, because this is the life I want and you are the person I want to be in it with." Rosa's heart was doing something specific and decided inside her chest. "Ask me," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Will you stay here, not just for another school year, but permanently, and be my wife?" Rosa looked at him in the October light, and the water ran quietly through the channel they were standing beside, and she thought about Ohio and her mother's letters, and the life she had imagined before she knew what the Texas plains looked like in the morning, and before she knew that a man could look at a piece of writing with hunger and determination, and that watching him learn something could be one of the most moving experiences of her life. "Yes," she said, "I will." He crossed the space between them and took her in his arms, and she went without any of the professional reserve she had been maintaining for the better part of 7 months, just completely and gladly. And they stood beside the creek channel in the golden October afternoon, and the wind moved through the grass, and it was, Rosa thought, exactly sufficient. They told Mrs. Halloway first, because it seemed right, and because Mrs. Halloway burst into such immediate and delighted tears that Rosa felt it would have been unkind not to let her be among the first to know. They told Emmett, who threw his hat in the air with an enthusiasm that startled the horses. Margaret, the housekeeper, made a celebration supper that included 3 kinds of pie. Cecil wrote a letter to Rosa's mother in Ohio, which he wrote entirely himself with only one request to Rosa for the spelling of a single word, a letter that Rosa's mother later told her she had read 4 times and wept it twice. Rosa wrote her own version of the same letter, longer and more detailed, and her mother's response arrived 3 weeks later and said, among other things, that she was coming to the wedding, which was perhaps the most decisive statement her mother had ever made about anything. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in December, which gave Rosa enough time to finish her obligations for the current school term, and to correspond with the school board about the continuation of her teaching position after marriage, a conversation she had with Harlan Dewey that was direct and clear-eyed, and resulted in an agreement that she would continue to teach through the coming year while they determined a longer-term arrangement. She had no intention of giving up teaching simply because she was married. She had also, she told Harlan Dewey, never met a rule that said she must, and he had discovered by this point that arguing with Rosa Garrison was less productive than simply agreeing. Her mother arrived from Ohio 9 days before the wedding on the afternoon stage, a small, energetic woman named Helen who had Rosa's same habit of direct speech, and seemed to take in the landscape of Texas, with the combination of mild alarm and brisk pragmatism that Rosa recognized from her own first weeks here. Helen Garrison approved of Cecil within the first 20 minutes, which Rosa considered a reliable verdict because her mother's instincts about people were accurate, and she did not perform approval she didn't feel. "He looks at you like you're the best argument he's ever encountered," Helen told Rosa the evening of her arrival, when they were sitting on the porch of Mrs. Halloway's in the cool December air. "I'm not sure that's a compliment," Rosa said, amused. "From a man like him, it's the highest one," her mother said. "He's not a man who takes things at face value, he thinks things through, so when he's decided about something, he's really decided." Rosa considered this. It was, she thought, an accurate reading of Cecil Prescott. The wedding was held on the first Saturday of December in the Ridgecreek church, which was a simple white building with a good stove that did its best work during the winter services. The town turned out to a degree that surprised Rosa, who had not fully understood how much she had become part of the community over the past 7 months. But apparently she had, because nearly every family in Ridgecreek was there, including the Holloways and the Aldermans and all 4 of Cecil's ranch hands sitting in a row in their Sunday clothes. Rosa wore a dress her mother had brought from Ohio, white cotton with a simple cut, practical and clean, exactly the kind of thing Rosa would have chosen herself. Cecil wore the coat she had seen him press carefully for their first hotel supper, with a new shirt, and when she came in through the church door and saw him standing at the altar with Emmett beside him, and the late morning light coming through the church windows, she felt something that was both entirely overwhelming and entirely simple, the feeling of arriving somewhere you have been traveling toward for a long time, and finding that it is exactly as good as you had hoped. The minister was a man named Reverend Calloway who had a tendency toward lengthy prayers but who, on this occasion, kept the ceremony straightforward and genuine. And when Cecil said his vows, he said them in the same way he said everything important, quietly and with complete attention, like each word was something he had considered and was certain of. And Rosa said her own vows with equal certainty, and the 2 of them stood in the small white church in the December light, and the congregation of Ridgecreek, Texas, watched them become a family. There was a celebration dinner at the hotel afterward, which Margaret and Mrs. Halloway had organized between them with a shared efficiency that was slightly formidable and extremely effective. The food was excellent. The company was warm. Emmett gave a toast that made most of the room laugh and Rosa's mother cry, and Rosa sat beside her husband, and thought that husband was a word that would take her some time to feel the full weight of, but that she was prepared to take the time. They moved into the ranch house, where Margaret had prepared the large east bedroom with fresh curtains Rosa had helped select from the dry goods store. Helen Garrison stayed for 10 days after the wedding, long enough to see her daughter settled, and to develop an efficient working relationship with Margaret that produced several excellent meals and at least one recipe exchange. And then she went back to Ohio on the morning stage with a hug for Rosa and a handshake for Cecil that turned into a hug as well, which visibly surprised him, and which he returned with a care that made Rosa love him additionally. Rosa continued teaching at the schoolhouse. It was a 4-mile ride from the ranch to the school, and Cecil drove her in the wagon on the mornings when he could, and she rode herself on the mornings when he couldn't, which she found she didn't mind, because the ride through the early morning landscape was its own form of pleasure. The school board renewed her contract for a full 2-year term in the spring of 1879, and this time Harlan Dewey presented the contract with the air of a man who understood he was getting a good deal and was grateful for it. The classroom had 18 students by spring, 2 more than it had started the year with, because 2 new families had arrived in Ridgecreek and settled on land south of town. Rosa applied to the school board for funds for additional desks, which she received, and for a new set of reading books, which she received after a longer negotiation, and for a proper map of the United States to hang beside President Hayes, which she was still working on. The mornings were different now without Cecil's lessons, which had come to their natural close sometime in the winter when she had said to him, honestly, that he was reading at a level where he didn't need instruction anymore. He needed practice, and he was getting that every day on his own. He had accepted this with the same equanimity with which he accepted most things, and had said that he was grateful for everything she had given him, and she had said it had been her pleasure and she meant it. He still read in the evenings. She would come home from school to find him on the porch with a book or a newspaper, reading in the late afternoon light with his boots off, and a glass of water beside him. And there was something about this image that she loved with a specific and particular warmth every single time she saw it. He had started reading to the children of the ranch hands as well. Felix had a daughter named Clara who was 7 and who had not been to school because the ranch was too far from town for daily rides. Cecil taught her letters in the evenings, using Rosa's teaching as his model, with a patience and clarity that Rosa, watching from the doorway of the kitchen one evening, recognized with a jolt of pure feeling as the thing she had recognized in herself long ago, the instinct for teaching, the pleasure in watching understanding arrive. "You could teach," she told him that evening. He looked up from where he was showing Clara the difference between the letters B and D, which were the letters Rosa had told him were the most commonly reversed. "I'm borrowing your methods," he said. "You're not just borrowing," she said. "You have the instinct. You know how to wait for someone to find it themselves." He looked at Clara, who was concentrating intensely on the letters on the slate. "My father couldn't teach me," he said. "Not reading anyway. I didn't want Clara to grow up without the door being open." Rosa leaned in the doorway and watched her husband teach the 7-year-old daughter of a ranch hand the difference between B and D. And she thought about what it meant that this was where they had all arrived. The daughter of an Ohio schoolteacher and a Texas rancher who had come to a schoolhouse at 7 in the morning with his hat in his hand. And a little girl in the lamplight learning her letters, because someone had decided not to let ignorance reproduce itself one more generation. She went into the kitchen and put the kettle on, and through the doorway she could hear Cecil's voice, patient and clear, saying the sounds the letters made. The following spring, 1880, Rosa discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Cecil on a Sunday morning on the ranch porch, with the plains opening out in front of them in the early light and the cattle visible on the far pasture, and he was quiet for a long moment with the particular quality of stillness that meant he was receiving something important. Then he took her hand carefully, as if she had become something fragile which she was not, and told him so, and he laughed quietly and said he was aware she was not fragile, and squeezed her hand instead of cradling it, which was more accurate. "A child," he said, in a voice she had never heard him use before. "In approximately 7 months," she said. "Dr. Patterson confirmed it. A child," he said again, "that can read." "Among other things," she said, laughing. "Among other things," he agreed seriously, "but also that." She taught until June, when the summer heat and the growing heaviness of late pregnancy made the daily ride impractical, and then she arranged for the school term to end 2 weeks early with the board's agreement, citing the circumstances, which Harlan Dewey accepted with an uncharacteristic absence of difficulty. She had been right that the Marsh situation had permanently improved his opinion of her, and 2 years of genuinely excellent student outcomes had done the rest. Their son was born in August of 1880 in the ranch house, with Dr. Patterson in attendance and Margaret in the kitchen making food for everyone, and Rosa's mother, who had come from Ohio again as soon as Rosa's letter arrived, sitting in the hall and praying in a focused and efficient manner. He was a healthy, loud, substantial baby with dark hair, and what Rosa, when she was recovered enough to examine him properly, thought were his father's eyes, though she acknowledged that she might be projecting. They named him Thomas James Prescott. Thomas for Cecil's father, James for Rosa's own father, who had died when she was 12. When Cecil held his son for the first time, standing at the window of the ranch house in the August morning light with the baby held carefully in his large working hands, Rosa watched him and thought that this was another poem, another 8-line truth that she didn't have the words for yet, but that she would hold on to. The specific image of a man who had come to her schoolhouse to learn to read standing in the light with his child. "Hello, Thomas," Cecil said quietly to his son. "I have a great deal to teach you." "And so do I," Rosa said from the bed. He looked up at her with an expression that was everything, the warmth and the seriousness and the private smile that she had been watching develop since the first morning he had sat in a chair that was too small for him and picked up a pencil with unfamiliar care. "You've been teaching him since before he was born," he said. "That's exactly how teaching works," she said. "You begin before anyone knows you've started." She was back in the schoolhouse by October, with Thomas spending the school day at the ranch in Margaret's experienced care, riding out in the mornings in the cooler autumn air with the plains golden on either side of the road and the sky immense above her. She felt, returning to the classroom after 2 months away, the specific pleasure of someone who has been away from something they love and has come back to confirm that, yes, it is still the thing they knew it was. Emmett had married by this point, a quiet, sensible woman named June who had arrived in Ridgecreek the previous year with her widowed father, and who had taken Emmett's measure with a clear-eyed pragmatism that Rosa recognized and admired. Emmett, who had spent years in California reaching for things beyond his grasp, turned out to be well-suited for being anchored, and the two of them had settled into the eastern section of the Prescott land in the modest house that had been there since the original property, and which Emmett and Cecil had repaired and improved together over the winter. The Prescott land was becoming something. Not just a cattle operation, but a worked place with a future, the kind of land that would have something to pass on. Cecil said this to Rosa one evening in the early winter of 1881, sitting on the porch with Thomas asleep inside, looking out at the dark land with the winter stars above it. "My father built this from nothing," he said. "He couldn't read a contract, but he could read land and cattle and weather, and he built something real from that. I want to build on it in a way that honors what he did without repeating what it cost him." "You already have," Rosa said. "I want more," he said. "Not more land. More." He paused, looking for the word, and she saw him doing the same thing he had done in the schoolhouse when he was reaching for a word he knew was there. "More capability," he said finally. "I want the ranch to be a place where the people who work it can build something too. Felix has been here 6 years. He has a wife and Clara and now another baby. I want him to be able to read contracts, to know what he's signing." Rosa looked at her husband. "Are you telling me you want to start a school?" "I'm asking you if you think it's possible," he said. "An evening class for the ranch workers and maybe some others from neighboring places, not instead of the day school, something additional." Rosa was quiet for a moment, thinking about it. How many people? 6, maybe 8 at present, could be more if word got around. "We would need materials," she said. "Slates, paper, primers. I can pay for those," he said. "We would need a place to hold it. The bunkhouse has a common room," he said, "or the barn in summer." Rosa looked out at the dark plains. The stars were very bright tonight. Thomas made a small sound inside the house, one of his sleep sounds, and they both heard it and relaxed when it didn't develop into a cry. "Yes," she said. "I think it's possible. I think it's worth doing." "I thought you'd say that," he said, and reached over and took her hand. They began in January of 1882, in the bunkhouse common room with a fire going in the stove, and a lamp on each of the 2 tables they had brought in, and 5 students. Felix and his wife Amelia, 2 other ranch hands named George and Sam, and a farmer from the next property named Cal who had heard about it through Emmett and ridden over to ask if he could join. George was entirely without literacy, and they started him from the letters. Felix and Amelia knew some letters but couldn't read words. Sam and Cal could read a little, haltingly, like men making their way through unfamiliar terrain, and Rosa placed them in a different stream of instruction. Cecil helped teach. It was not how she had originally planned the sessions, but it was how it naturally developed, because he understood the experience of learning to read as an adult from the inside, and his instinct for it, which she had seen demonstrated with Clara, was genuine and reliable. He worked with Felix and George on the alphabet while Rosa worked with the more advanced students, and she would hear him from across the room, patient and direct, saying the sounds, and she would feel that same wave of warm recognition that she had felt watching him with Clara. Clara, who was now 9, was one of Rosa's most capable students at the day school, working 2 years ahead of her age level with a facility for reading that delighted Rosa. She had told Felix and Amelia this directly, the way she would have told any parent, and Felix had looked at her with an expression that contained several years of complicated feeling and said thank you in a voice that meant many things simultaneously. By spring, they had 8 regular students in the evening sessions. By summer 11. Word had spread, the way things spread in rural areas, not through announcement but through conversation, one person telling another that there was a place out at the Prescott Ranch where a person could learn to read and nobody would make them feel lesser for not already knowing how. It was not an official school. Rosa was careful to be clear about that. It was a private educational effort by private citizens, which kept it outside the school board's jurisdiction and concerns. But it was real and it was working, and the students who came made the same kind of steady progress that her day students made when they came consistently and applied themselves, which most of them did, because adults who choose to learn something have already done the harder half of the work. In the late spring of 1883, 2.5 years after Thomas was born, Rosa discovered she was expecting again. She told Cecil on a Monday morning before she rode to school, matter-of-factly, while Thomas was eating his breakfast at the kitchen table and explaining something complex about a dog he had seen. Cecil set down his coffee cup and looked at her with that warm, unguarded expression that still arrived with the same completeness as it had the first time she'd seen it. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. Thomas looked up from his breakfast. "Another what?" he asked. "A baby," Rosa said. Thomas considered this. He was 2.5 and his understanding of the concept was still somewhat theoretical. "Okay," he said and returned to his breakfast. Cecil looked at Rosa across the kitchen table and the lamp in Thomas's breakfast, and the smile that moved across his face was slow and genuine and everything. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. Their daughter was born in November of 1883. They named her Helen, for Rosa's mother, who received the news by letter, and whose response arrived 3 weeks later containing so much emotion compressed into efficient language that Rosa read it 4 times. Helen Prescott was a person from the first breath, energetic and opinionated, with a quality of determination that appeared very early and never left. Thomas, who was 3 when she arrived, approached his sister with the careful interest of a small scientist encountering a new specimen, and within 2 weeks had decided she was acceptable, and within a month had appointed himself her primary guardian, a role he took seriously for his whole childhood. The ranch in the middle years of the 1880s was a working, living place with real roots. The cattle operation was solid and profitable, managed by Cecil with the same thoughtful competence he brought to everything, and with Emmett's energetic contribution on the Eastern Range. The evening literacy sessions had become a permanent fixture, attended by a rotating group of adults from the surrounding land, some of whom came for a season and moved on, and others who stayed for years and became capable readers and whose lives, Rosa knew, were genuinely different for it. She taught at the day school until the board finally built a second schoolhouse south of town and needed a second teacher, at which point they hired a young woman from San Antonio named Clara Beaumont, who had proper teaching credentials and who Rosa took under her guidance with a feeling of pleasant continuity, passing on the approach she had developed and seeing it understood and absorbed. There was a moment in the autumn of 1885 when Rosa came home from school to find Cecil on the porch reading to Helen and Thomas. Helen was not quite 2, which was a bit young for what he was reading, but she was sitting in his lap with complete contentment, and Thomas was beside him with a book of his own open on his knees, reading ahead to see what happened next with an impatience that Rosa recognized as a family trait. Cecil was reading from the book of frontier poetry she had lent him years ago, the book he had read in one evening and then told her about the morning after. He was reading the poem about the evening grass. Rosa stopped on the path from the gate and listened. His voice was easy and clear now, nothing like the careful, laboring sound of those first mornings in the schoolhouse. He read with the natural rhythm of a person who had made the transition from decoding words to inhabiting them, and the poem about the evening light and the long grass moved through the autumn air, and Rosa stood on the path to her house and felt, completely, what her life was. Helen noticed her first and announced her presence with the enthusiasm of a 2-year-old who has spotted someone essential. Thomas looked up from his own book and then back down, in the manner of a 5-year-old who has nearly reached the good part. Cecil looked up and found her on the path, and the expression that moved across his face was quiet and full and entirely directed at her. She went up the porch steps and he shifted Helen to make room, and she sat beside him, and the October light was golden and low, and the plains extended in every direction around them, and Thomas turned his page, and Helen touched Rosa's sleeve to make sure she was really there, and Cecil read the last 3 lines of the poem in his clear, settled voice. When he finished, Thomas said, without looking up from his own book, "Can you read the next one?" Cecil looked at Rosa. His eyes were warm and dark, and the same as they had been the first morning she had really looked at them, before she had learned to be careful about looking too long. "What do you think?" he said. "Read the next one," she said. He turned the page and began, and the evening light moved long and golden across the Texas plains, and Rosa Garrison Prescott sat on the porch of the ranch house she had come to as a stranger, and had stayed in because she found everything she had been looking for, and she listened to her husband read. Ridgecreek grew in the years that followed. The railroad arrived in 1887, connecting the town to the larger network that was transforming Texas, and with it came new families and new commerce and eventually a second school, and then a small library, which Rosa had written to the county about for 3 years before it happened, and for which she was given quiet and appropriate credit. The library had a reading room open to anyone, adult or child, which was something she had specifically required in her correspondence with the county, and which she considered perhaps the most important single achievement of those letters. Thomas started school the autumn he turned 5, and was already reading above his age level, which Rosa disclosed to his teacher with some care, so as not to create the wrong kind of expectation. He was a serious, industrious child who loved numbers as much as he loved words, and who would eventually, 20 years later, go to the University of Texas in Austin and come back to practice land law in the county, a symmetry that Rosa would think about sometimes with a quiet satisfaction that was almost too large to look at directly. Helen was a different kind of mind entirely, instinctive and emotional and physically fearless. A child who read voraciously not for information but for feeling, who could tell you precisely how a story made her feel, but sometimes couldn't tell you what happened in it, which drove Thomas slightly mad, and which Rosa found completely understandable. Helen grew up to teach, as it happened, eventually taking over the Southern Schoolhouse when Clara Beaumont married and moved to Houston, and the Prescott name on the school board rolls of Ridgecreek ran into the next generation, and then the one after that. In the spring of 1889, 10 years after Cecil had first walked into Rosa's schoolhouse with his hat in his hands and asked her to teach him to read, they held a small gathering at the ranch to celebrate the anniversary of the evening literacy sessions. It was not a formal event. Margaret made cake and there was good coffee, and the people who had come through those sessions over the years came and sat in the common room of the bunkhouse and the porch of the main house and talked. Felix was there with Amelia and Clara, who was 20 now and teaching Sunday school at the church and working at the library 3 mornings a week. Cal was there, weathered and steady, who had learned to read at 52 and who still came to borrow books from the ranch's small collection of volumes Rosa had assembled over the years. George was there with his wife, who had started coming to the sessions in the second year and who had advanced further and faster than anyone else in the group. There were others, the new and the returned, the people whose lives had moved through these evenings and taken something away. Cecil stood at the end of the evening and said very little, in the way he had always said things. He thanked the people who had come. He said that learning was not a thing you could be given, but it was a thing you could be given access to, and that the difference was important. He looked at Rosa when he said it, across the common room with its lamplit faces, and she looked back at him, and 10 years of mornings were in that look. The small chair at the back of the school, and the first morning with the slate and the paragraph he had read aloud the first time all the way through, and the evening by the creek and the wedding and Thomas and Helen, and every morning of every year between. He crossed the room when the gathering began to break up, the way he had crossed the road years ago to meet her at the schoolhouse door, with that same direct, purposeful movement. "Thank you," he said, which was what he had said the first morning, hat in his hands. "You already said that," she told him, which was what she had essentially said then too. "I'll keep saying it," he said. "You don't have to," she said. "I want to," he said, and took her hand. Outside, the Texas spring was in full statement, the plains flowering in the way they occasionally did when the conditions were right, and the ranch that had been his father's place and then his, and was now there stretched out in the dark under a sky full of stars. And Rosa Garrison Prescott stood beside her husband in the doorway of the bunkhouse, with the lamplit gathering behind them and the night ahead of them. And she thought that this was the story she had never known she was going to be in. The one that started on an ordinary Tuesday morning when a man walked into a schoolhouse doorway and said he wanted to learn. She had opened the door, as he had said, but he had walked through it. And they had built everything that came after together, word by word, morning by morning, the way all real things are built, not in a single decisive moment, but in the accumulation of days, each one ordinary and each one, also, entirely sufficient. The next morning she rode to school in the early light, the way she had been doing for 11 years, and the plains were wide and golden on either side of the road, and the sky was the color of something that poetry reached toward and sometimes caught, and she thought about all the children waiting in the schoolhouse, and about Helen growing up with her nose in a book and Thomas with his in a survey map, and about Cecil at home reading the morning paper at the kitchen table with his boots still on, because she'd been known to tease him about taking them off when he read and he had been known to forget. And she thought about all the evenings ahead and all the mornings and all the words that had not yet been learned and were waiting. She tied her horse at the schoolhouse post, unlocked the door, and went in to teach.